Hey gang, let's talk a little D&L today, Chapter 8, which deals with a couple of things. At one end, this D&L is pretty straightforward, and I hope you took the time to read and write your draft first, because we're at that point in the year when you really should be getting the hang of what the historiography is on this chapter. And the historiography on this chapter is both very straightforward and a little tricky. And so I want to talk about the sort of straightforward angle to this, and I also want to talk about the tricky angle to this. And I'm going to be pretty specific about how I want you to handle it, even though it may not feel that straightforward as we go through. So what do we have here in this chapter of D&L? We've got, first of all, the title, which deals with the top and bottom rails. This was a metaphor that's very popular in dealing with the freed peoples after the Civil War. It comes from I believe it was a letter originally published in a northern newspaper, or a letter to the editor to a southern newspaper, where the former slave who has achieved freedom and is living in the North says to his former owner that the bottom rail's on the top now. In other words, being a free man in the North was better than being a defeated Southerner. And that his position had changed from being the very bottom to being the very top. When we talk about Reconstruction, we're going to see that there was this great sort of burst of hope in the African American community, but that burst of hope doesn't last very long. And we run into Jim Crow, which is going to be the beginning part of semester 2. So in terms of this particular D&L, we're talking about the freed men and women after the war, and how do we obtain their point of view both after the war and, more importantly, during the time of slavery itself. How do we obtain that slave point of view? So if you're looking at your draft and you're saying, aha, I put down point of view as the historiography, then hooray, you found what they're talking about. Except I'm going to change it. And I know that's not very nice, but I think you'll understand why as we go along. I want to talk first about point of view, however, and I want to do something that's completely outside of the D&L. And I want to remind you of an important African-American poet, and it's fair to say an enslaved poet, because Phyllis Wheatley died before she was freed, and who knows whether or not she would have been freed. She's an 18th century slave who achieved great fame in her very short life. I think she died before she was 30. And she's the first African American published poet. And let's just really take a quick look at this poem, because I think it tells us a couple of things about point of view. First of all, it's undeniably Phyllis Wheatley's point of view, because it's Phyllis Wheatley's poem. But now notice the title, On Being Brought from Africa to America. That's the name of the poem. And the poem says, "'Twas mercy brought me from my pagan land, taught my benighted soul to understand that there's a God, that there's a Savior too. Once I redemption neither sought nor knew. Some view our sable race with scornful eye. Their color is a diabolic dye. Remember, Christians, Negroes black as Cain may be refined and join the angelic train. This is a brilliant poem. This is a brilliant poem, and I am not even a smart enough literary analyst to break poetry down, and I can see the brilliance. So if it's there for me, I know it's there for you as well. And I want you to focus on two things. The first part of this poem, written 50 years before the hardcore antebellum South. Remember, we talked about the fact that Southerners argued that slavery was good for the slave. And the first part of this poem seems to back this up. She's writing in the 18th century, and she seems to be foretelling what whites are going to say about African Americans. And she says that when she was in Africa, once redemption, neither sought nor knew. I had no idea about religion and Christianity, and I didn't even know to ask about religion and Christianity when I was in Africa. But now that I'm in the New World, I understand that my soul can be saved. There is an aspect to this part of the poem that really feels, it shows she was enslaved. She's making the argument that her enslavement has a positive angle, and that's going to appeal to a society of book buyers that are enslaving people. But understand the rebellion in this poem. Look at the second part of this poem. And she says, some view our sable race. Okay, sable was the color black that was often used in the 19th century, and obviously she's using it in the 18th. Some view our sable race with scornful eye. In other words, some look at blacks and say, I'm not sure. And then she quotes those people who are viewing their race with a scornful eye. She says their color is a diabolic dye. In other words, being black is diabolical. And then she very strongly says, remember, Christians, Negroes black as Cain may be refined and join the angelic train. And she's saying redemption, forgiveness, equality. Redemption equals equality. If she can join the train of angels in heaven just as a white person can, then she is equal to the white person. There is a rebellion in this poem as well as an acquiescence in this poem. Now, why am I talking about poetry when poetry is in no way a part of this D&L? It's because Davidson and Lyttle tell us understanding what slaves think, what slaves thought, what enslaved people's lives were like, is diabolically hard. It's hard to know because look at Phyllis Wheatley in this very famous poem of hers. You can see her dancing between what white audiences want to read and what she wants to say. And she's one of the very few people that gets to actually have a book, although she didn't get to enjoy that book very long because she died. She died really very, very young. She did not enjoy her fame. There are a handful of slave narratives. And on the left, you can see the cover of an anthology edited by a very important African-American historian named Henry Louis Gates, Jr. And it mentions some of the really important narratives. The picture there is Olada Aquino, and I'm probably mispronouncing that. And of course, we've talked about the narrative life of Frederick Douglass, the third book down. And there was a film of one of the famous slave narratives called 12 Years a Slave. And so there are a handful of moments when slaves have written, former slaves have written about their experiences. Not many. When you consider the millions of slaves, the handful of writings is not very much. And so what Davidson and Lyttle say is that early historians depended too heavily on the words of whites about what slaves were like. In other words, the observations of slaves, and that those observations were very, very inaccurate, so inaccurate that the historian William Denning comes up with this idea that slaves were these happy-go-lucky, childlike creatures that were better off in slavery than they were as freed people, which is outrageous on its face. But that's what Denning said, and what was believed historiographically for a while. And so Davidson and Lyttle paint us a picture about point of view, about how hard it is to find the point of view, and then introduce us to a guy named Lomax. And what Lomax does is he brings to the Federal Writers Project during the Depression what are called the slave narratives. So from 1936 to 1938, Lomax, and let's get a picture of Lomax here. John Lomax is going around the South recording African Americans and former slaves. Now, I want to take a moment and go a little bit further than D&L, because D&L talks about the fact that John and his son Alan made these recordings. They leave out some of the other important anthropologists that are doing this. And they also leave out the fact that Lomax's real goal here, his desire, was music. It was not the slave narrative. It was the folk music. Lomax went around not just recording the narrative stories of these former slaves, but he also went around recording the music of folk people, white and black, Appalachian Hill music, South Carolina island music, deep Florida, the Gulf Coast, Creole music. He was absolutely intrigued, and he rigged a recording device in the back of his car. There's a picture of it in the D&L, you can see it, so that he could record the music of these folks. It became quite popular in terms of popular music. So Lomax records music. That's his main goal, but he also ends up recording the stories of some of these slaves. And that's where I want to talk about what D&L are really all about in this chapter. And that is oral history. What is oral history? And they show us in a big way with the transcript of the slave narrative from Susan Hamilton, or Susan Hamlin, whichever name you want to give to her. She's the same person interviewed twice. That oral history is both valuable and problematic, and you've got to approach it that way. And that's why I'm going to tell you, and take a look at your draft, that your topic sentence should be something along the lines of, in Chapter 8 of James West Davidson and Mark Hamilton Lytle's After the Fact, The Art of Historical Detection, the authors discuss oral history using the slave narratives as an example. Now, if you have in your draft talked about point of view, hooray, because that's a really important, I think, secondary aspect of this chapter. And so if that's what you came away with, please note, I've spent half of this mini talking about point of view. It's really important, and it's really hard. But the historiographical message of the chapter is historians interview people who lived the history. And when they interview them, it's called an oral history. And when you've got an oral history, it's really important. It's great because those are the people who were there. They saw it. They lived it. They understand it and can talk to you in a way that's very important. The problems, however, especially with the slave narratives. And that's why I think D&L used the slave narratives as their chief example. It's because it's so easy to see the problems. The problems here revolve around the fact that most of the slaves, most of the people who lived through slavery were dead at this point. By the time we get to the 1930s, we're decades beyond slavery. And so the people who were still alive, who had experienced slavery firsthand, who had been enslaved, they're very elderly. Their memories might be a little less than perfect. And as we saw with Susan Hamlin or Hamilton, depending on who she believed was interviewing her, she completely changed her story. Just as Phyllis Wheatley, 200 years earlier, had set up a poem that would both, challenge the white audience, but also acquiesce to the white audience. We see this in Susan Hamilton's discussion. And when she's talking to a white interviewer, she's painting one picture. When she's talking to a black interviewer, she's painting a very different picture, and honestly, a picture I think that's a little bit more approachable. You also have the problems of geography that D&L talk about. These are not slaves from all over the South. These are slaves that Lomax found, or I shouldn't say slaves, former slaves that Lomax found and recorded. And so you've got geographical limitations, you've got age limitations, and you've got the limitations of the perception of the people being interviewed. And those are all hard. Now, this does not mean that oral history is bad. It means that oral history, like every other aspect of historical sources that we've been talking about, whether it's John Smith and his Generale Histoire of Virginiae, and the fact that he was biased, the source was still valid, but the historian has to take into account the bias. Okay, the oral history is valid, but the historian has to take into account the problems. Sometimes it's bias, sometimes it's other things. Sometimes it's the quality of the recording. There's that little tiny tag. I don't know if you read those pages right at the end of the chapter where it compares modern historical oral histories like NPR's project. It's the name of it's not coming to me, but it compares that project with the Federal Writers Project, and it's quite different. So how are you going to structure this? D&L abstract? Well, first of all, we've talked about the topic sentence. The historiography is oral history, the Federal Writers Project, or the experience of freed people. It could be, or the experience of slaves and freed people could be an example, however you want to do. But I think the thing that you want to do after your topic sentence is set up this problem of the slave point of view, and the historical problem of trying to piece together from the very few slave narratives that we have and these very few oral histories that we have, and trying to piece together what it was like. And then go into, and you've got to spend a lot of time with Susan Hamlin and Hamilton, because they go to the problem of spending 4 or 5 pages giving you the full readout of their transcription of her 2 different interviews. So I think you need to spend some time with her and show how she and her interviews give both the power and the problems of oral history. So I hope that makes some sense to you. And good luck with the abstract, and I hope to see you in class really soon.